Hello again and welcome back to another episode of CleanTechies, the podcast. This is Season 2, Episode 12, or if you're counting from the beginning, Episode 24. Again, always please subscribe and tap the bell to be notified, and if you're watching on Apple Notes or Spotify, please leave us a review so we can continue to rank the show higher. Again, a quick reminder also, this podcast is made possible and sponsored by NextWave Partners. NextWave is passionate about working with people and organizations to drive the transition towards a sustainable and innovative future. NextWave Partners creates opportunities and shapes markets globally by providing elite human capital solutions. So if you are looking to grow your team or take your career to the next step, I really do consider reaching out to NextWave. You can reach out to them directly at info@next-wavepartners.com, or you can reach out to one of their consultants through their website, which you can find at next-wavepartners.com, and go to the team section and find which consultant might support your area best, and reach out to them directly. Again, also want to make mention to our other sponsor, Tiago Energy, which we'll hear more about at the end of the show. So with that, let's get into today's episode. Today's episode was with Chris Bolman, founder at Brightest, an ESG tech platform that helps track ESG emissions data, as well as help create strategy for companies moving forward, how to kind of reduce their footprint and be ESG compliant. Very interesting conversation. I had a conversation similar to this with Holly at Sustainabase a while back, but this conversation was a little different, and we talked about kind of a wider range of things in general. Chris was just a super interesting fellow to speak with, hearing his backstory and how he got into the space. So I was really keen to share this conversation with you guys. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. So with that, let's get into the show. All right, welcome to the podcast, Chris. Glad to have you. How are you doing today?
Yeah, pretty good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, it's a pleasure to have you on. I'm very excited for this. So I guess why not just start with kind of introducing yourself and what you've done, what some of your accomplishments, and just a bit about your background for the listeners.
Yeah, sure. So, my main job today, I'm the founder of an organization called Brightest. So we're kind of primarily focused on helping organizations that are doing social impact initiatives, sustainability, ESG work. I think kind of one of the unfortunate challenges and maybe one of the guarded secrets in this space is that ESG and CSR and sustainability are like super cross-functional in an organization, right? Like it touches leadership, it touches the products you make, the office you work in, operations, HR. Like it has so many different kind of considerations for an organization. And I think like as a result of that, like you end up needing to build lots of like coalitions and committees. You end up needing to like do a lot of fact finding and like working with different departments and different teams. And like that collaboration is like super challenging. A lot of these teams are like small, it's only a couple people. If that, they don't necessarily have a ton of budget. They don't necessarily have a ton of tools. And so we're basically trying to design kind of the collaboration layer for ESG within an organization. A lot of that involves like data collection, from suppliers or vendors or from other parts of the organization or even from employees, but also helping organizations with workflow around like measurement, goal setting, reporting, and things like that.
Got it. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about kind of how did you come to be interested in this space? Like kind of what led you to this? What were some of the realizations you had along the way? Just very curious to hear kind of your backstory.
Yeah, for sure. So this was definitely kind of an all roads lead to Rome experience for me over the course of my career. So I had the either good or bad, kind of depending on how you look at it, fortune of like basically graduating right into the 2008-2009 economic downturn. And in a sense, like that was actually kind of good and liberating because like when I was in college, there was almost like this templated career destiny system where like you were either an accountant or a consultant, or you went to Wall Street, or you became a lawyer. But like there kind of were like only a couple careers, and like everybody did that. Like that's what like all my friends were doing, and that's what everybody was kind of planning on doing. And like graduating into a world where like jobs were not available, jobs weren't certain, you were kind of asking yourself like, what is Wall Street actually doing? Was cool. And so I found an opportunity at like a little tiny like solar energy company. It was like 8 people. And they were hiring, and business was actually going pretty well for them, despite kind of the overall environment. And so started working at that company, and that really like exposed me to a lot of different things. Obviously I understood solar and how like distributed energy and renewables work, but you learn about grids and batteries and inverters and electric vehicles and things like that. And that kind of opened my eyes to one, like the possibilities around sustainability and electrification of our economy. Honestly, this was like, again, like 2008, 2009, like climate change wasn't really in the public consciousness the way that I think it is today. Like Al Gore was doing stuff and there were a few initiatives, but like you didn't have Greta Thunberg, you didn't have Sunrise Movement. We weren't talking about this with like the Biden administration, like the way sort of AOC and other folks have like brought this into the forefront. And so it was more just kind of like understanding how that system worked, but also really understanding like how all the different pieces kind of fit together. Because again, I think this is hard from a systems perspective because it's just so complicated, right? It literally like encompasses all of society. But like, we have a huge environmental footprint associated with like food and industrial agriculture, and that's super challenging. And like, we need to work through that. Obviously, we have like our energy mix, we have transportation, we have buildings, energy efficiency. So it's like, again, there's all these different levers, and they also like touch on other social issues, right? Like poverty and inequality and racial equity. Like these are very like closely aligned themes. And so just kind of understanding those different things and kind of how they fit together was like super enlightening for me early in my career. But because of a couple of reasons, I actually ended up getting kind of hired into like a venture-backed tech company. That's kind of another story on how that happened. But one of the really interesting things there is like, one, they let me like do a lot of stuff. I was like doing communications and marketing and growth and different things. We had this with sort of like a .org like CSR initiative where we did some like employee volunteering. Like I set up a partnership with like Charity Water and did some nonprofit stuff. Like we had fundraisers, and it was a really like cool kind of powerful example of like on a micro level, like how that stuff like improves the brand, like builds culture, builds camaraderie and sort of connectivity among employees. It kind of just like makes a company a better version of itself. And so I was like thinking about those things at the same time that I was thinking about some of these other themes. And interestingly enough, like the product that we were building at the time, the company's since been acquired, but we were kind of helping really large organizations with like complex communication campaigns. Like that was basically the gist of the software. And the interesting thing, right, is like, you can do that for like MasterCard, or you can do that for Levi's or these like big organizations. And I was thinking about it and I was like, well, if we're thinking about like climate change or sustainability and some of these things, like they're kind of like humanity and as well, like almost every organization's like biggest communication challenge, which is like, how do I educate my workforce? Like, how do I educate voters? How do I educate people and like get people the information and things that they need to make better decisions? And so I was thinking about it and I was like, okay, I kind of like understand the space. I've spent time and I've sort of seen how the technology side of things work. Why is no one making this technology to like deal with these big social issues? And so that's why ultimately I ended up kind of leaving to start Brightest. And then, just started asking around, doing a bunch of interviews, talking to different organizations to really try to understand like what are your real problems and like what's kind of holding you back from positive change. And I think that's helped us really kind of hone and iterate the message and figure out how to build Brightest better.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I think it's interesting. The thing that you kind of the theme here is that you said that everything is kind of tied in, which I think is interesting and I think is very true. And it's just very complicated, like you said, to pull it all together. So I'm curious, maybe could you break down, because I want to go through two things. I want to go through kind of what is ESG, and then how do you go about attacking the problem of collating all of this information and making it something that can be actionable and very easily understandable from companies. So maybe let's start with kind of what are the big aspects and the big buckets within ESG.
Yeah, so for anyone who doesn't know, right, ESG stands for environmental social governance. And so it's essentially a framework that investors often look at for evaluating companies, right? So like publicly traded companies, will have an ESG rating or score that various analysts will assess or assign. A lot of companies and a lot of organizations are doing kind of public ESG reporting and putting out like an annual report, an annual impact or annual ESG reports kind of alongside like their 10K and their financial reporting. And so in one sense, it's a governance framework that's asking organizations, like, what are you doing in terms of like your environmental performance? What are you doing from a governance standpoint around different stakeholders and diversity? Because again, I think like historically organizations have not really accounted for one, diversity, but also really like the externalities of their business. You know, there's some frameworks, like for example, the impact weighted accounting project at Harvard that sort of starts to get into this. But like historically, as like an organization, and I think fossil fuels is a perfect example, you can do this like very extractive stuff where you can, you know, mine or refine oil or frack or whatever, and you don't have to like pay for the pollution that you're generating. That's not on your balance sheet, right? And so ESG is basically saying, well, actually, like maybe that should be on your balance sheet, or at least that should be within the risk profile of your organization that investors are assessing you on. And then I think there's also this aspect in ESG as well on the kind of social side around, again, like what are you doing for society? What are you doing for your employees? What are you doing for the different stakeholders and constituents inside your company? Because it's not just about creating shareholder value, it's about sort of creating shareholder value and social value and how you balance those considerations.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think that's helpful. That's helpful to understand there. So I guess then kind of on to the next part of it is how do you, given that there's a lot of data that could be collected here, and there's probably each organization may have a different kind of thing that they want to collect. How do you go about deciding what to collect, how to collect it? I'm assuming there's not a lot of kind of existing frameworks that makes it really simple. I'm assuming there's a lot of different data pieces you have to look at. So could you walk us through your thoughts on how you've been developing that and just generally the strategy there?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think the first thing that almost every organization should do, and a lot of them have done already, although this is not necessarily something you should only do as like a one-off, like I think it's important to kind of do it up front, but then continue to kind of revisit your hypotheses, assumptions, is a lot of organizations will start with a materiality assessment. So this is kind of a term that gets thrown around, but essentially the idea is like, these are the material aspects of our business, and you know you can look at things on like a 1 to 10 scale, for example, or 1 to 5 scale. Like the scale is kind of slightly less important, but it's saying, you know, what are the things that are like important to our business? What are the like material concerns? What are the things that we can influence? And then what are the things that are kind of important, again, to like stakeholders and to society? So there's a couple different kind of frameworks that you're looking at. But essentially, you're sort of trying to build out this like chart of saying like, this is something that is super material to our organization and really important to society. So ergo, we should focus on that most. So like, for example, with like healthcare organizations, because we see a lot of stuff in healthcare, like drug pricing and drug availability or medicine or healthcare access is like a really important one, right? There's a lot of questions around like how drugs are priced and healthcare costs and stuff, right? So like, how do you more equitably make sure that healthcare is accessible? That's super relevant from a business standpoint to the organization, but it's also super relevant from like a social perspective. So that's something that you might score as like a 10 out of 10 on both of those axes. But the idea is you want to kind of go through this process of really kind of looking critically at your organization. Our kind of recommendation is like, try to kind of narrow it down to about 20 to 30 things that you think, again, are like really relevant to your business and are also kind of really relevant from a social or an environmental standpoint. Try to kind of rank those. You know, you want to do surveys. So survey your customers, survey your executives, survey your employees. You can start to like pull that data together and say, okay, like this is what we think is most important. Here's what this community thinks is most important. And then you can start to kind of break that down and prioritize. And I think once you kind of understand what's material, like once you've done that materiality analysis, then you can say, okay, like what is the strategy that we're going to try to drive positive change around these things? What are the different KPIs or metrics that we're going to use to measure it? Essentially, it's like you kind of have to do the kind of look in the mirror and really like understand and assess how your organization operates, and also the social or the economic context that you operate in, and then kind of drill that down into priorities and themes, and then figure out how to like tackle each of those strategically, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's kind of just having to get the gist of what is going on and what is important for us as a business and what can we tackle first thing first, right? Because obviously you can't tackle everything, so you got to choose something, right?
Yeah.
I'm curious, generally speaking, there's probably a number of things we could go down. I'm very curious about the advantages of for a business, of tracking these things. I'm assuming there's multiple ways you could go. Love to hear your thoughts, but also one area that I'm interested in is what are the advantages, competitive business advantages to companies tracking this data that could possibly set them apart from the market in some way? Just kind of curious to hear if there's financial rewards or whatnot.
Yeah, there's really a ton of established benefits to strong ESG performance. I mean, so it's pretty well established that strong ESG performers kind of outperform their peers from a shareholder value standpoint. So if you look at like the performance of like the best ESG organizations that are publicly traded versus like the S&P 500 or benchmarks, like strong ESG is outperforming. Part of that may be a result of there's a lot of capital flowing into ESG, but in general, like strong ESG performers tend to have better profit, have better growth trajectories, tend to win better margins. I think strong ESG performance also correlates to winning talent, right? Like if we think about right now in the economy and the job market, it's a pretty tight job market, particularly with like younger employees. But I think this really spans all ages, but I think it's particularly true for millennials. Like a lot of younger people who are job seeking are actively picking organizations that they feel are doing good for society. And so if you're in kind of a competition with a really talented person, and kind of net the business fundamentals are similar, they may choose which organization is doing better on the ESG side. And similarly, right, like there's also a lot of established research rather, that more diverse organizations, like organizations that are hiring more people of color, have more women in leadership and things like that, also tend to outperform their peers and tend to be better companies to work at. And so if you're basically creating an environment where employees are more motivated, they're more engaged, you're attracting better employees, that necessarily, and your employees are sticking around longer and you're retaining them, that has like massive implications for like productivity, innovation, potentially can save you costs. So there's a ton of benefits to doing it well, in my opinion. And I think the research on that is continuing to bear that out.
Yeah, I just actually read something, and there was a Gallup poll. I think it said that 69% of job seekers really consider the environmental impact of a business. So it's interesting that you say that, having just read that. I guess another thing is with the kind of the supplier side of things, right? I think that this is an issue. I think it's more so on the social side. It can obviously have the E as well in it, but how do companies with huge like reliance on massive supply chains that are probably in other countries across the pond, how do they try to get that data? And is there anything they can do to try to help kind of, I don't know, force them a little bit to be better about some of the things they do, making sure that there's no kind of negative social impact or environmental impact as well?
Yeah, it's a really great question. It is very challenging. So, I spoke to someone who is working at one of those companies. It's a massive company, billions of dollars, many lines of business, really complicated supply chains. And almost all of that work right now is happening just via spreadsheets. And basically internal folks are doing research. They're asking around, they're building out these spreadsheets, even just to understand kind of their partner ecosystem. And there are traditional, and there have been kind of supply chain and logistics softwares. And so a lot of like procurement teams and a lot of larger organizations will have systems that they use to kind of manage vendors or potentially onboard vendors and things like that. I think where we've kind of seen a pretty big gap, and actually one of the things that we get asked around the most, is for help on the supply chain side or on the partnership side. And there's a couple reasons why. I think one, like understanding kind of the carbon footprint or the environmental footprint of your supply chain is super challenging. And that's not something that I think traditional supply chain technology has really taken much of a look at or done a very thoughtful job around. I think that's starting to change. Like I'm actually seeing that starting to change. But I think there's some interesting things that, like, for example, Brightest can do that I have not seen in traditional tools there. There's been a lot more questions recently around like labor standards and things like that, right? Like, obviously consumers want to know that like child labor wasn't used, or that like the humane treatment of workers is important, particularly in like global supply chains. And getting that transparency and kind of understanding where something goes from like raw materials and point of origin to manufacturing to distribution, again, becomes really, really complicated, and it's hard to get that information. But a lot of companies, a lot of like really big, well-known companies like Disney and Amazon are starting to basically ask these questions to their suppliers and to their business relationships, basically saying like, can you prove this? Like, can you document this? Can you tell us what your scope 3 emissions are? And I think the reality is like a lot of organizations are like, oh, no, we can't, like, we don't know how to do this. And so I think there's a lot of like figuring that out collectively right now, but I think there's a great opportunity to leverage better technology tools in terms of, again, aggregating and understanding that data. And that can take so many different forms, right? Like there's RFID potential, there's like blockchain potential, there's just like literal basic file management potential better and stuff like that. Like there's so many different opportunities, and there's a bunch of different things we're looking at, but that seems like a very evergreen space that's ripe for change. And there's a lot of pressure, impetus to actually make that happen now.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. And I think that the companies that can obviously, that have they supply a lot of things, right? If they can get to that point where they've kind of led the charge to track their data and show it transparently, they'll probably win some more business. Because obviously there'd be a lot of pressure as some individuals or some companies start to kind of do that there'll be options for the buyers, right? So that's interesting. I find that very fascinating, the whole idea of trying to help kind of these, just even sometimes small suppliers, right? Some of the small things that they might have a little bit more of an advantage because they have less data to track. They might be able to get up and get those certifications or whatever they would be sooner. Okay, curious to understand in terms of just kind of broadly speaking, what do you see as trends with this whole, because obviously this whole idea of ESG is really kind of focused around the idea of transparency with everybody, amongst every organization, between customers, et cetera. What do you see as kind of a trend with just data being available to the public, such as data that cities collect or whatnot? I'm just curious if you see any big trends with that kind of relates to this idea of transparency.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I think one of the biggest like executive level themes is around diversity. Like, I don't know if you sort of saw this stat, but like essentially like chief diversity officer is like the most hired role, or the fastest growing like C-suite executive role in 2021. So like a lot of organizations are really trying to think about like pay scale and their hiring process and like other kind of equity factors of the work that they're doing. On the other hand, diversity data is super thorny and complicated. Like it's really, really sensitive information to track and to store when you start to get into things like sort of people's identity. And so in a lot of cases, like organizations are actually like hiring specialists or using like outside firms or other organizations to actually like own the diversity data, because it's like almost like a compliance risk issue to like own a ton of internal diversity data or do a bunch of like data surveillance. So like diversity is actually one of those like unique cases where like it can be detrimental to own and collect a bunch of data. And you have to be, I think, a little more thoughtful about how you're approaching that. I would say on like the opposite side, on like the environmental side, I think it's really just collect as much data as possible, but be intentional about it. Because again, like it's more important to collect a couple things and measure a few things really well. Like for example, greenhouse gas emissions, like, metric tons of like carbon and carbon equivalents, right? Like that's a really, really important metric. Or, how much industrial waste or chemical waste or whatever your organization is creating, and then setting kind of really thoughtful and like science-based reduction targets around that. So I think the challenge is that, again, like a lot of organizations have been not necessarily kind of flying blind, but like are still trying to develop like the models and the forecasting to understand that. because again, I heard a good example of an organization where, it's really trendy to make these commitments and say like, we're going to go net zero by 2030 or by 2040, right? It sounds great. It makes for a great press release. Like your customers love you. Again, like your employees are excited about it. But then there sort of becomes this question of like, can you actually do it? Um, you know, and like I've had some interesting conversations recently where like organizations have just flat out admitted like either it's impossible, like we know we can't do it, or we don't know whether or not we can do it. And so we don't want to say it until we know that we can do it. Whereas I think on the other hand, I think there's some organizations who kind of just say it, but don't know that they can actually do it. So I think again, like data can really help there in terms of like helping organizations make more thoughtful assessments and also kind of tracking progress, right? Because, again, it's like you may issue earnings and then have to like restate earnings, or there may be like an accounting adjustment or something, right? Like the same thing is going to happen with carbon accounting, where an organization, sets a target and then has to like roll it back, right? And it's like that's a really complicated and nuanced communications consideration, but like, and there may be again in the future like real regulatory implications around that, particularly in places like Europe where we're already seeing that. But yeah, those are the types of things that I think organizations now need to be thinking about.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's interesting to me. Something I've noticed with a lot of the people who've come on here with some of the solutions they've come up with is the knowing very detailed, small bits of data, not so much broad swaths like in energy management for buildings, right? All of these small things, just having that data can really be helpful to reduce waste or cost in just generally running buildings and stuff like that. Or there's all kinds of examples of it. So I think that's interesting how that would play out. I'm very curious to see it. I would love to see kind of more public partnerships with, between just consumers and the government or whatnot, because it gives people the opportunity to help move things faster. I don't know if you have thoughts. Do you have thoughts on kind of the relationship between government and kind of private sector?
Yeah, I am also a big believer in like public-private partnerships. I think it's really, really important. I think a lot of funding is kind of coming into the system now from some of the stimulus activities. And I think in general, right, like, public funds end up funding a lot of the innovation that society achieves or ultimately taps into, right? Like, we have public funding to thank for like solar panels. We have public funding to thank for the internet and things like that, right? So like, there's a lot of examples where researchers and academics will kind of pave the way. The government will end up funding things, and then kind of the private sector is really good at like productizing and scaling it and taking it to market. And I think those similar types of things apply here. I think they particularly apply, as you kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, around like from an urban perspective with cities. Like cities are a great example where there's just so many opportunities for innovation. Like I live in New York City. I was just biking home this afternoon, and like, now there are electric buses or like e-buses that you're starting to see on the streets as like the MTA starts to roll this stuff out, right? Like that's a perfect example of like a public-private partnership around like the MTA, like electrifying its entire vehicle fleet and things like that. There's just so many of those like public-private partnership opportunities that we're seeing more and more of.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that to me, the hard part is that it just tends to be, and this is again from like a talent perspective, that the people who end up in government jobs sometimes are just not the most, like they're not really there to be innovative per se. They're kind of more there for stability, for example. So I think it's like trying to find a way to maybe as government leaders or the public sector to just try to attract those people and find ways to be innovative and be a little bit more agile there. Do you have any specific thoughts on kind of the regulatory landscape in the US here, kind of as it changes? Obviously, you mentioned Europe's probably a lot further ahead than we are on these regulatory things, but I'm curious if there's major items you see coming down the line. What is your thought in general on the importance of the regulatory, regulation helping to promote these things and advance these things? I'm just curious to hear that.
Yeah, it's a great set of questions. I definitely think, very complicated and hard to fully predict the future. But, I think Europe is pretty clearly heading in a decarbonization direction. They're passing laws and directives that are essentially going to kind of force organizations in the EU to decarbonize over the next roughly 20 years, right? So, we're going to see the end of combustion and diesel cars in Europe in our lifetime. Organizations are going to have to kind of dramatically scale back their environmental footprint. There's lots of new kind of laws being introduced around verifying claims, auditing sort of ESG statements, making organizations report, but also kind of really like thoughtfully hit these emissions targets. And I think the Europe in general is definitely ahead of the US in terms of thinking about, food equity and environmental sustainability and transportation and things like that. Canada is also starting to get in the game. They're doing some things. There's also some activity in Asia, so it's not even necessarily just a Western thing. But I do think the U.S. is a little bit behind from a regulatory standpoint, just because, because of the congressional system and based on kind of how deadlocked Congress is, it's hard to kind of pass transformative legislation. Like some stuff is happening, and we'll see what happens with Build Back Better. But again, I think things are getting a little slowed down or diluted in some sense. But I think the SEC is definitely looking at this, and I think the SEC is probably going to start to come out with stronger opinions on kind of ESG and sustainability claims. So again, like as an organization, you're not just going to be able to say that, you're carbon neutral and offer zero proof. Like you'll actually have to underwrite and report and substantiate these claims that you're making. So I think, that's in progress. A lot of like federal agencies are looking at their kind of carbon footprint. So for example, talk to a pretty big like government agency that's thinking about, basically going through the process of like doing this materiality assessment and carbon benchmarking for its operations. Because, again, the US federal government itself has an enormous carbon footprint. Like I think the US military's carbon footprint is like equal to the nation of Portugal's. And so there's a lot of opportunities for like just our government to reduce its environmental footprint. And then I think there's also a lot of opportunities at the state level as well. So for example, even in the absence of federal policy, states can do a lot of transformative stuff. Again, like California's done good things, Washington State, Colorado, New York is doing a lot of really good things. So for example, going back to the public-private partnership theme, like NYSERDA has like an energy accelerator that it's doing in partnership with like SUNY Binghamton and different like private sector organizations, where it's kind of like government funding and like government name and stability is helping some of these like energy innovations get off the ground and kind of de-risking the initial investment and development of like infrastructure so that these organizations can scale up and kind of deploy solutions. Like there's a lot of good stuff happening there. There was the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which was passed in 2019 in New York State, which sort of sets New York on a path to reduce its carbon footprints pretty significantly. So I think that's one of the other things that gives me a little bit of cause for optimism. It obviously depends on the political landscape of the state. But a lot of states aren't really waiting for the federal government. They're kind of taking action anyway. It makes things more complicated for organizations. But if you have 2/3 of the US economy pushing for decarbonization at the state level, like that also can drive a lot of progress.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if that happens, because obviously it's going to be different in each state, and then eventually there'll probably be a consolidation at some point. Because correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that a lot of times when major changes happen in kind of the way this country is run, it comes through states changing things at kind of on a broad scale, and then eventually the federal government steps in and says, okay, we're going to do this, and then it's maybe more formalized. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's a great example. You see that with like interstate transportation and a lot of other considerations, like the way that utilities are governed in the United States, and kind of our energy infrastructure is primarily governed at a federal level, unless you're in Texas, because Texas tends to kind of do its own thing.
Yeah, it's a good theme they have going on there. But okay, that's interesting. So I guess one thing I think maybe one of the last big questions I'm curious about, or maybe there's two more here. What do you see as these tools that, for example, Brightest is making? As I'm sure there's going to be many of these kind of tools created as they roll out across the world and help companies to start tracking these things. Do you see there going to be any specific type of service that will pop up? I'm just curious from your perspective, seeing what is happening. What do you anticipate being the next step? What types of companies might support or services might come up that are new and going to kind of just help continue to take this to the next step? Because obviously there's tracking, but then there's of course implementation.
Yeah, there's a lot of different opportunities, and I think a lot of different ways that organizations can kind of innovate and tap into value. So, I think probably the first area is just like replacement and materials innovation overall. So like, how do we replace our packaging with more sustainable alternatives? Like, how do we replace plastic with like biodegradable materials? Or, I just saw recently, I can't remember their name, but there was a startup that just raised money where they're sort of doing like biodegradable organic like chemical replacements, and they're basically trying to replace industrial chemicals with like more sustainable inputs and things. So there's a lot of innovation happening on the material side that I think is super interesting and exciting. Obviously, like the best way to conserve energy is not to use it in the first place. So there's a lot of opportunities and still kind of low-hanging fruit around energy efficiency. Again, like there's really simple stuff like installing LED light bulbs and smart meters that I think more and more organizations are kind of getting involved in and taking the plunge and doing that work. Again, some are ahead of the game, some are not. But as more and more of kind of our real estate and building infrastructure gets modernized and retrofitted, and we think more about lights and consumption and smart grids, there's a bunch of opportunity there. Trying to think what are the kind of some of the other themes that I see. Yeah, I think, again, like as I mentioned, like supply chain assessment, carbon benchmarking, super important. Really just being able to kind of make better decisions. And then I do think like a lot of this is ultimately kind of cultural, or there is a big education component to this, which is like, this is a conversation I've had a bunch of times, which is like consumers, I think, want to work for and want to buy from sustainable companies, but we don't really have like a very good established definition of that, right? Like, I might go and I might like buy some shoes from Allbirds because I've read they're sustainable, or they say on their website they're sustainable. But like, am I as an individual consumer reading their sustainability report? I don't know. Like, I probably would because like I'm nerdy and I am interested in stuff like that. But I think the average shoe buyer does not know what the carbon footprint of like a Nike Air Force One is, right? Like they just like see Nike saying that it's a sustainable company, but they don't know that like the Air Force One is their like most carbon intensive shoe or whatever, right? Like, and I think like there are sort of basic things of like, I think people are trying to understand and more critically evaluate the brands they support and buy. And I do think a lot of brands and organizations are sincerely trying to buy positive change. But there becomes this question of like, as a consumer, it's a lot of burden and a lot of technical stuff on me to really understand the nuances of this. So it's kind of like the role of the brand as like a good steward to help me understand like, what are the differences? What are the trade-offs? Why is this better for the environment? Like, why should I buy this as opposed to this? Because again, I think, historically we've like put a lot of the burden on individuals of like, you got to recycle and you got to not use plastic and stuff like that, when like, yes, an ocean is made of like a million droplets of water, but on the other hand, like most of the environmental footprint of the modern economy is a couple dozen companies in a couple dozen countries. And like, that's where the accountability kind of really lies, in my view.
No, that's interesting. I think I've never thought about that before, but the idea that if you kind of create the option, right, it's going to be more widely accepted. I think that for me, growing up in the middle of nowhere in Wisconsin, a very kind of like conservative, red type of place, it's very, you don't talk about climate change much. Like people aren't really a big fan of, like, they don't believe it, right? There's a lot of these things they just don't understand. They still think solar energy is inefficient, et cetera. And it's like, okay, guys, you're reading data from 20 years ago. So I think this idea of just kind of showing people, hey, there is a way. Like, I just bought a pair of sneakers from Nothing New, right? Like and then showing everybody and like super proud to show everybody like, hey, these are made from recycled water bottles, right? All these things. And people are like, oh, wow, there's actually such thing as like a cool looking shoe that's made from recycled materials, right? So I think that's an interesting perspective. It's just leading the way as a company, and the people will buy it, right? Because it's not like they're going to go seeking out the one bodega in New York City that has water bottles that are compostable or something like that.
And I think like plant-based food is a really good example of that, or sort of plant-based meat, right? Because like if you think about like Impossible or Beyond Meat, like it's not about the Impossible Burger being vegetarian. It kind of needs to just like be at Burger King and be at a cheap enough price point and taste good enough that people are willing to buy it, right? Like there's probably maybe 10 to 20% of people who are going to be like the early adopters who are like, oh yeah, Impossible Burger, like I really want to eat that. There's probably a lot of people honestly in the middle, if you think about, one of those like Clayton Christensen adoption curves,
Mhm.
where it's like, I care about the price, I care about the availability, I care about the taste. And if you can deliver me a meat substitute that's better for the planet, that's like not inconvenient and tastes just as good, like I'll switch to that, right? Like it sort of comes down to this like basic aspect of decision making. And I agree, like I grew up in the Midwest as well. It's like if you can go to your friends and you can give them an Impossible Burger and you don't even tell them it's not meat and they eat it and they're like, that's pretty good. Like that's sort of how you like win people over, right?
Exactly.
Like there's, the people Midwesterners love their meats and their barbecue, and I think that's a big cultural change that probably never going to truly happen. But it's sort of showing people that hey, like plant-based can be cheaper, it can be healthier, it can be better, and then ultimately letting people make their own decision.
Yeah, I think that seems to be the way. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Um, I guess one last big thing is, you talked a little bit about just general public education. We're kind of talking about it now, but do you see a lot of initiatives, or is there anything that you're involved with to help, whether that's work with universities or just educate the public in general, on how these things work and what the more sustainable options are? Like, I'm just curious to see your thoughts and trends on the kind of partnership between education, also, not just for consumer habits, but also for getting talent into these places, et cetera. Just kind of curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's definitely a rising tide that lifts all ships, and I think like pretty much any effort there is beneficial and virtuous. So for example, I just gave a talk at a university to their student government, and I'm trying to kind of help their student government like articulate some things better and help them make some connections to try to like help them kind of see what's possible and understand how to better message it to the student body. Because they were sort of saying the same thing, which is, there's probably like 20% of students who really understand these issues very well, and then the rest of the student body probably doesn't understand it as well as maybe they need to. I do think there's a lot of opportunity to develop kind of school curriculum, and honestly that can be like elementary school, high school, university. There's actually probably more movement at the university level recently over the last couple of years. Like I'm seeing people majoring in sustainability or social impact, and again, like I'm not that old, but when I was going to college, like none of that existed. And like there's great programs at like, Yale, like FES, for example, and a lot of other universities that are doing really good things there. So I think actually kind of the university ecosystem for sustainability education from a curriculum standpoint is pretty good. I think it's reaching more people earlier on, like in high school and earlier on, and like helping them kind of understand these things. And we definitely do different things, right? Like we publish a weekly sustainability newsletter. We have done tutorials, we write things, I try to go speak at universities and do other stuff. I've kind of pitched a couple organizations actually on doing more like collaborative media partnerships. We haven't been able to like really come up with anything. And part of that is just a function of we're also kind of a small startup. Like we're pretty busy. We're kind of trying to do the core things and like make our customers happy and develop technology. So like media and education is a little bit of it's a nice to have. And so I think that's why it's a great thing that, I can talk to folks like you on a podcast and you're kind of helping to share the word. But yeah, I think it's super interesting. I think curriculum design around social impact and sustainability is super important. And, the equity component of that too, which is like, how do we make this available not just to like wealthy, really well-educated people, but how do we make this available like in public schools and, to people who aren't like working at startups or aren't getting these same opportunities.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I'm just very keen to see, especially with the fact that there's going to be so many new types of, roles and types of companies out there in the next decade. I'm interested to see how this works out, with maybe kind of, I don't know if you will, if venture capitalists giving tips to universities saying, hey, this sector is popping, you should make sure you create a curriculum for it ahead of time so we can hire people. I'm just curious of that because again, growing up also in the Midwest, I was homeschooled. There's just like, it's not really told to you kind of the opportunities and the types of roles are out there, right? I think you touched on this when you mentioned when you were graduating, there was kind of like these set career paths. I still think while there's a lot of options and there's a lot more kind of variety there, a lot of people aren't aware that there are so many different kinds of career paths.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I would not necessarily say that curriculum is super reactive to the job market. Like, for example, even like the engineering, like software engineering curriculum at a lot of universities is like just now kind of catching up to where Silicon Valley's at. And like that, that took like a decade or so. And so, this is going to take time. I mean, I think you said it pretty well yourself. Like, we're kind of talking about transforming our entire economy, or like that's the aspiration, is like, we're going to have entirely different companies, entirely different cities. We're going to consume products made from different materials. We're going to kind of live our life mostly the same, but like there will be some adjustments. We'll have to think through like how the whole thing, like flying planes, is going to work, because that's a particularly tricky one. But I think in general, it's like, it's not really a quality of life difference. I think it's mostly a quality of life improvement. Like mostly we're going to be healthier. Hopefully we'll have like electric self-driving vehicles. There are actually maybe less car accidents and things. People will be breathing better air. So there's a ton of benefits to doing this, but it's a pretty sweeping change. Like, as I said, kind of right at the start, like every organization, particularly big organizations, are going to have to change what they do in a pretty significant way. And I think we're just now kind of collectively starting to understand the extent and the ambition of the change that's required, in order to prevent a pretty rough future, if we don't do anything, or if we don't do enough.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think this is like being able to talk to so many people on this podcast, and this just showed me that all of this stuff is intertwined because of the fact that it all has to change, right? Like, I'm obviously came up from a different kind of education background than most people, and just seeing that this kind of alt education is taking off pretty heavily as well. I'm interested to see the continuation of that with all of these things that we're talking about. But anyways, this has been really great, Chris. Really appreciate you coming on the podcast. And yeah, we'll have to have you on again soon. As soon as Brightest is taking over the world with their ESG platform. So if any closing thoughts you wanted to make.
No, I appreciate anyone tuning in. I appreciate you for doing this. Obviously, thanks for having me. But no, I think this is kind of the whole point, is like, in history, change tends to kind of start with the minority, and then the minority does enough and kind of makes enough noise and makes a strong enough case that pretty major change ends up happening, right? Like, you can really change the world, and it can sort of really snowball from humble beginnings. And so I think it's just important to understand that, like, we are part of the early phase of this transformation, and I think we are kind of have a unique opportunity in history where we actually like have the power to change it and do it. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be like incredibly hard and chaotic and disruptive, and we're all kind of learning along the way. But I think it's better to try to do this than sit on the sidelines. And so this takes so many different people doing so many different things. Like, it's much less a competitive thing, and it's much more a collaborative in terms of how we can grow and support each other. So I think it's cool that you're doing this. I think it's cool that you're supporting the ecosystem. And I think we need more of this.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Chris. I really think that was great closing thoughts there in general. Like, everybody's going to work together on this. So really appreciate that. And yeah, we'll see you next time. Thanks for coming on.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. Take care.
Hope you enjoyed today's episode with Chris. Hope you enjoyed the conversation in general. I thought it was extremely enlightening to just have a chat with him. Really did enjoy that conversation. Obviously, want to make mention to our sponsors, Tiago Energy. Dare to be different with Tiago Energy. The leader in module-level power electronics from Silicon Valley has revealed the installer-focused energy intelligence residential solar plus battery storage solution. You can go to tiagoenergy.com/CleanTechies. That's TIGOENERGY.com/CleanTechies for more information. And as always, we ask people to please do share this podcast with a friend, comment your thoughts wherever you interact with us. Always curious to hear what you thought of the show, what your thoughts on certain aspects or topics were. Any questions you'd like us to ask in the future, please do let us know. You can reach out to me directly via Twitter at Silas Maynor. Again, also, always reminder, subscribe to the newsletter, which comes out every month on the 27th, and join the Slack channel if you're interested in becoming more of a part of the community. Again, there's no big commitments. We just like to chat about kind of certain topics, share certain things that we learn or read about that are interesting there. So a great way to get involved further. So again, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the podcast.